My guardians invited me to a fancy family dinner but told me to sit at the kids' table while my married cousins sat with the adults. I quietly got up and left. Hours later, they were desperately calling me. I, 27M, never thought a family dinner would be the breaking point that changed everything between me and the people who raised me. But sometimes it takes one moment of complete disrespect to realize you've been accepting scraps your entire life. My guardians took me in when I was 8 after my parents died in a car accident. They had 3 kids of their own, all older than me, and I spent my childhood trying to earn my place in a family that never quite felt like mine. I worked harder than anyone, got better grades, stayed out of trouble, and convinced myself that if I just proved my worth, I'd finally belong. At 27, I'm a software engineer making 6 figures. I own my condo outright, drive a Tesla, and have more in savings than most people my age dream of. My 3 cousins, on the other hand, are still figuring things out. The oldest works retail and lives paycheck to paycheck with her unemployed husband. The middle one bounces between part-time jobs while her spouse does construction work. The youngest just got married last year, and they're already asking the family for money to cover their rent. But none of that mattered when my guardian announced the seating arrangement for their anniversary dinner last weekend. The fancy restaurant was their choice. They'd been planning this celebration for months, inviting extended family, making reservations at the most expensive place in town. When I arrived in my best suit, I felt good about myself. I'd even bought them an expensive gift and was looking forward to celebrating their milestone. Then came the moment that shattered 20 years of carefully maintained family dynamics. My guardian pulled me aside and explained that they'd arranged special seating. The adults would sit at the main table while the younger generation would have their own space. I assumed this meant all of us cousins together, which seemed reasonable enough. But as everyone found their seats, the reality became crystal clear. My 3 cousins, all married now, were being seated with the adults. I was being directed to a small table in the corner with my guardian's nephew and niece, ages 12 and 14. The kids' table. At 27 years old, with a career they could only dream of, I was being relegated to the kids' table while my underemployed, financially struggling cousins sat with the grown-ups simply because they had wedding rings. I stood there for a moment, letting it sink in. Everyone was watching, waiting for me to just accept it and sit down like the compliant child they still saw me as. The same way I'd accepted everything else my entire life. My guardian noticed my hesitation and explained that married people belonged with the adults, as if this was some natural law of the universe. The casual way they said it, like it was obvious and reasonable, hit me harder than any deliberate insult could have. I looked around the table at my cousins, expecting maybe one of them to speak up, to say this was ridiculous. Instead, they were already settling into their seats, avoiding eye contact. The oldest even had the audacity to look embarrassed for me. That's when something inside me snapped. I didn't make a scene. I didn't argue or raise my voice. I simply walked over to the kids' table, picked up my gift, and headed for the exit. My guardian called after me, asking where I was going. I told them I suddenly remembered I had somewhere else to be. The drive home was oddly peaceful. For the first time in years, my head was completely clear. I wasn't angry or hurt or confused. I was done. I spent the evening doing exactly what I wanted. Ordered Thai food, watched a movie, played some video games. It felt like the most authentic night I'd had in months. Then my phone started ringing. The first call came around 9. My guardian wanted to know why I'd left so abruptly. I let it go to voicemail. They called back 10 minutes later. Then 20 minutes after that. By 11 p.m., they'd called 8 times and sent a dozen texts asking me to call them back, saying they were worried about me. The oldest cousin started texting too, saying I was being dramatic and that I'd embarrassed everyone by leaving. I turned off my phone and went to bed. The next morning brought 23 missed calls and 47 text messages from various family members. Apparently, after I left, the dinner had become incredibly awkward. Other guests had started asking questions about why I wasn't there, where I'd gone, what had happened. My guardians had to explain the seating arrangement to people who found it as bizarre as I had. The breaking point came when my guardian's own sister apparently asked why their successful foster son was being treated like a child while their adult children, who still needed financial help, were being given positions of honor simply for getting married. That afternoon, my guardian showed up at my condo unannounced. They wanted to talk, to explain that I'd misunderstood the situation. They insisted they hadn't meant anything by the seating arrangement, that it was just easier to organize that way. I invited them in and listened patiently as they tried to justify what had happened. They kept emphasizing how much they loved me, how I was family, how they couldn't understand why I was so upset over something so trivial. When they finished, I calmly explained that I was done, not just with family dinners, but with accepting a secondary position in a family where I'd never truly belonged. I told them I appreciated everything they'd done for me as a child, but I was an adult now and I got to choose who I spent my time with. They seemed shocked that I wasn't backing down or apologizing for my reaction. They'd grown accustomed to me being the peacekeeper, the one who swallowed his pride to keep everyone comfortable. My guardian tried a different approach, suggesting we could forget about the whole thing and move forward. They even offered to have me over for dinner that weekend, promising I could sit wherever I wanted. I thanked them for the offer, but declined. I explained that this wasn't about where I sat at one dinner. It was about a pattern of treatment that had been going on for 19 years, and I was finally old enough and secure enough to recognize it for what it was. They left confused and frustrated, clearly expecting this to blow over like every other family conflict had in the past. It didn't blow over. Update 1. The next few days brought an avalanche of family drama that I watched unfold from a comfortable distance. My guardian started calling other family members to get them to intervene on their behalf. They painted me as ungrateful and oversensitive, someone who was throwing away a loving family over a simple misunderstanding. But their plan backfired spectacularly. Several relatives called me directly to get my side of the story. When I explained what had actually happened, their reactions ranged from disbelief to outright anger on my behalf. My guardian's sister was particularly vocal about how inappropriate the whole situation had been. Apparently, she'd been thinking about it since the dinner and had realized this wasn't an isolated incident. She started recounting other times over the years when I'd been treated differently from the biological children, times when she'd noticed but hadn't said anything. Other family members began sharing their own observations. The picture that emerged was of a family where I'd been kept in a perpetual state of childhood, never quite allowed to graduate to full adult status despite my obvious success and maturity. My guardian's brother called to tell me he'd been uncomfortable with the seating arrangement but hadn't wanted to cause a scene. He apologized for not speaking up and invited me to have dinner with his family instead, joking that I could sit at the head of the table if I wanted. The cousins' reactions were mixed but telling. The oldest sent a long text message explaining that they hadn't realized how the situation looked from my perspective. They claimed they'd been too focused on their own problems to notice I was being treated unfairly. The middle cousin was more defensive, insisting that married people naturally sat with other married people and that I was reading too much into normal family dynamics. Their response actually validated my decision more than any support could have. The youngest cousin surprised me by calling to apologize. They admitted they'd felt weird about the seating but had been afraid to say anything because they didn't want to rock the boat with the grandparents. They asked if we could still maintain a relationship outside of the larger family gatherings. But the most interesting development came from an unexpected source. My guardian's neighbor, who had been invited to the anniversary dinner as a family friend, reached out through social media. She'd been watching the whole drama unfold and wanted to share her perspective as an outsider. She told me she'd been shocked by the seating arrangement and had actually asked my guardian about it during the dinner. According to her, when she'd questioned why I wasn't sitting with the other adults, my guardian had become defensive and snippy, insisting that their family dynamics were none of her business. She also revealed something that made my blood boil. After I left, my guardian had apparently made comments to other guests about how I'd always been difficult and ungrateful, how they'd sacrificed so much to raise me, and this was the thanks they got. This woman, who barely knew me, had been so offended by these comments that she'd defended me to people at the dinner. She told them about my career success, my independence, and how mature and respectful I'd always seemed in the few interactions she'd had with me. Her message ended with something that hit me right in the chest. She said she had adult children of her own and couldn't imagine treating any of them the way I'd been treated, regardless of their marital status or how they'd joined the family. That night, I realized something important. I'd been so focused on trying to earn my place in this family that I'd never stopped to consider whether this family deserved a place in my life. Update 2. 3 weeks after the dinner, my guardian showed up at my workplace. They'd apparently gotten tired of me not answering their calls and decided to corner me in a professional setting where I couldn't just walk away. The conversation was brief and uncomfortable. They stood in the lobby of my office building, demanding to know how long I was going to keep punishing them for an honest mistake. They insisted that other people had been filling my head with nonsense and that I was letting strangers destroy our family relationship. I kept my voice calm and professional, very aware that we were in my workplace where my reputation mattered. I told them that no one had influenced my decision, that I was perfectly capable of recognizing disrespectful treatment on my own. They tried to argue that I was being oversensitive, that in their day, respect for elders meant accepting family decisions without complaint. I pointed out that I was 27 years old and had been supporting myself financially for nearly a decade, so perhaps it was time to update their expectations. The conversation ended with them threatening to cut me out of their will if I continued with this stubborn behavior. I thanked them for the heads up and suggested they might want to leave before building security got involved. That threat was probably the most liberating moment of this entire situation. It confirmed that they saw our relationship as transactional, that their love and acceptance had always been conditional on my compliance and gratitude. After they left, I sat in my office thinking about how different my life might have been if I'd recognized these patterns earlier. How many opportunities had I missed because I was always trying to maintain peace with people who saw me as a permanent obligation rather than a valued family member? That evening, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. I started planning a life that didn't include them at all. I updated my emergency contacts, removing my guardians and replacing them with close friends and the few family members who had genuinely supported me through this situation. I changed my address with various institutions and made sure they no longer had access to any of my personal information. Most importantly, I stopped feeling guilty about setting boundaries. The relief was immediate and profound. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's expectations or trying to earn approval from people who were never planning to give it freely. My social life improved dramatically. Without the obligation of family gatherings and the emotional exhaustion that came with them, I had more energy for friendships and activities I actually enjoyed. I started dating again, something I'd neglected while trying to manage family drama. I also began to understand why I'd struggled with romantic relationships in the past. I'd been so accustomed to accepting conditional love and secondary status that I'd been attracting partners who treated me the same way. 6 weeks after the dinner, I got a call from my guardian's sister asking if I'd consider attending her son's wedding. She assured me that it would be a different situation, that I'd be treated with the respect I deserved, and that she'd personally make sure there were no seating chart shenanigans. I appreciated the gesture, but I declined. I explained that I needed some time to figure out what healthy family relationships looked like before I jumped back into family events, even with relatives who meant well. She understood completely and told me the invitation would remain open whenever I felt ready. That conversation reinforced my decision to prioritize people who respected my boundaries over those who saw boundaries as personal attacks. Update 3. 2 months later, I ran into the middle cousin at a coffee shop. They looked uncomfortable but approached me anyway, saying they wanted to clear the air. The conversation that followed was revealing in ways I hadn't expected. They admitted that they'd always resented the fact that I'd achieved more financial success despite being the outsider in the family. They'd been dealing with their own insecurities about their career and marriage, and seeing me relegated to the kids' table had felt like validation that they still ranked higher in the family hierarchy. Their honesty was brutal but enlightening. It confirmed what I'd begun to suspect, that my success had been threatening to some family members, and keeping me in a subordinate position had been a way of managing their own insecurities. They apologized for not speaking up at the dinner and asked if we could rebuild our relationship on more equal terms. I appreciated their candor, but told them I needed more time to process everything that had happened. During this period, I also received an unexpected message from my guardian's neighbor again. She wanted to let me know that my guardian had been telling people around the neighborhood that I'd abandoned the family over a minor disagreement, painting themselves as the victims of an ungrateful child. What made this interesting was that several neighbors had come forward to share their own observations about how I'd been treated over the years. Apparently, more people had noticed the family dynamics than I'd realized, but they'd stayed quiet out of politeness. One neighbor mentioned that they'd always found it odd how my guardians introduced me to new people. While the biological children were introduced as my son or my daughter, I was consistently introduced as the boy we took in, or our foster son, even decades after the adoption was finalized. Another neighbor recalled a graduation party where my academic achievements were barely acknowledged while my cousin's much smaller accomplishments were celebrated extensively. These outside perspectives helped me understand that I wasn't imagining things or being overly sensitive. The differential treatment had been obvious enough for strangers to notice, which meant I'd been gaslit for years into thinking it was normal or justified. Armed with this clarity, I made my final decision about the relationship. When my guardians called on my birthday, wanting to take me to dinner and put this whole thing behind us, I politely declined. I thanked them for everything they'd done for me as a child, but explained that I was building an adult life with people who saw me as an equal. They were clearly frustrated by my continued boundaries, but something in my tone must have conveyed that this wasn't a negotiation. The conversation was shorter than previous attempts at reconciliation, and they didn't call back. 3 months after the dinner that changed everything, I hosted my own gathering. I invited the family members who had genuinely supported me, along with close friends and colleagues who had become my chosen family. Everyone sat at the same table. Everyone was introduced the same way. Everyone was treated with equal respect and consideration. It was the best family dinner I'd ever attended. Looking back, I'm grateful for that moment of disrespect that finally opened my eyes. Sometimes it takes a clear display of how little someone values you to realize you deserve better. The kids' table wasn't just about seating arrangements. It was a perfect metaphor for the role I'd been assigned in this family my entire adult life. I'm 27 years old. I own my home. I have a successful career, and I'm building relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation and guilt. And I will never sit at anyone's kids' table again.